So my journey into ministry is one in which there were some obstacles and some obvious U-turns. One obstacle was when I was in high school and I knew I had a calling to ministry. I was growing up in a faith tradition that didn't allow for women to be in leadership in the church. So that obstacle made me think of maybe some other options in my life. I was really good at math. And so my math teacher, who knew that I was pretty smart, she said, "You really should try science and come take my chemistry class." I said, "Okay," because I'm smart enough for something like this. And I get into the first day of class, and on the board is the assignment for the day. Write at least 100 observations of the candle burning on your desk. So I got started. The candle is white. The flame is yellow. There's smoke rising from the candle. The flame is hot. The wax is melting. I am not going to be a scientist. So I quickly decided, I'm not going to be doing that. I need to change my classes, but I had to go to this class for a few more days until my schedule could get moved around. And I did hear in that class then this important lesson about motion. Newton's third law of motion. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Now I know, what does this science lesson have to do with Jesus' entry into Jerusalem? And it isn't about whether or not stones can actually speak. But I do want us to think about how Jesus' entry in Jerusalem was a reaction. It was an opposite showing of the events that had happened in the days leading up to Jesus' entry. You see, what was going on at that time is this lead up to the Passover celebration, when God's people, known as the Israelites, the Jews, were preparing and coming to Jerusalem in order to partake in this ritual of remembrance, a remembrance of how God had liberated their ancestors from the hands of the oppressive powers of Egypt and Pharaoh. It was that Passover celebration to remember that God had the power to save the people from death, that liberated them to become a nation. And this is what the people had always wanted ever since that Exodus story, to become that nation that was powerful, that would take its place in the world. But at the time of Jesus, the Roman Empire was at work. And every year, as this Passover holiday came about, or remembrance came near, Pontius Pilate would enter into Jerusalem. And he would enter from the main gate of Jerusalem, the grand gate on the west. And he would come in on a mighty stallion, and he would be in all of his regalia. The army behind him, the Roman soldiers with all of their armor and their clanking swords. There would be trumpets and drums that were being beat. It was like a Macy's Day Parade, right? Just full of grandeur and pomp and circumstances. And people knew what they needed to do. They needed to line that street where Pontius would come in, and they were to genuflect, they were to bow down to him, they were to sing out the praises of the Roman Empire, all the while knowing inside of their head that God would someday liberate them. But you see, the Roman Empire, Pontius Pilate, needed to make sure that there wasn't going to be any funny business during the Passover celebration. There wasn't to be any rumors of revolution. There wasn't to be any kind of movement toward creating some sort of revolt. And this is how the Passover holiday or the Passover season would start. So Jesus, knowing what his mission was, knowing what God was calling him to, makes some choices about how he enters into Jerusalem. Because you see that God had always been at work bringing restoration and reconciliation and redemption to God's people. This entry of Jesus into Jerusalem wasn't just this first time that that God was going to do some redemptive work, wasn't working to liberate God's people and God's creation. And so Jesus makes some decisions to tie in his entry to that which the prophets had been proclaiming for generations. And so we hear how Jesus came in on a donkey, the colt, a young foal, the young donkey, one that has never been ridden. And this is to fulfill the prophecy of the prophet Zechariah, who proclaimed that the king, God's king, the one who would come and rule under God's power, would enter into the city on a young donkey. Now, this is very different than Pontius Pilate's entry on that big horse that would have been broken and beaten into submission so that Pontius Pilate could control its every move. No, Jesus rides in humbly as a servant. In addition, when we hear how Jesus speaks about the stones crying out or shouting out, this is a kind of a callback, a remembrance how the prophet Habakkuk prophesied to the people that when there are oppressive governments, when there are structures that are built by the blood of others or by the blood of innocents, the very stones that built the structure or part of the structures will shout out about the injustices of an empire that is oppressive and violent. So when those religious leaders said to Jesus, "Tell your disciples to be quiet. This is not the time for revolution. You don't have an army of soldiers behind you. You don't have the powerful king image that we need to take over this government. You are not the one, so tell them to be quiet." Jesus says, even the stones will cry out. Even the stones will shout about the injustices of the world and the lack of seeing how God will redeem. This entry into Jerusalem is the beginning of this week-long ministry of Jesus, fulfilling that mission to show the world that God's reign is different than the ways of the world. As we travel ourselves through this Holy Week, through Holy Thursday and Good Friday, as we sit in the darkness of death of Holy Saturday and come to celebrate the resurrection of Christ on next Sunday on Easter, we might do so knowing that even today, stones are crying out for the injustices of our world. That there are powers who are oppressive. There are structures built on the bloodshed of others and the violence of evil hearts. And the injustices of the world are still God's concerns. God continues to use Christ and Christ in us to speak and bear witness to the redemptive power of God. And so as we journey, and as we consider this Palm Sunday, may we be witnesses. May we continue to shout out our hosannas, to sing praises to God who redeems us. And if we find ourselves needing to be silent, may we hear the stones that still cry out. For God's reign is upon us. God's peaceful kingdom is still at work. We are asked to participate in bringing to this world the kingdom of heaven. May it be so. And may the stones cry, and may our voices be heard, giving thanks to God always.